Richard Strauss was the last giant of classical music. He accomplished immortal works for the concert hall as well as for the opera. His role as a performing artist cannot be overestimated either. His collaboration with congenial artists of the literary and theatrical arts is unique and can still be felt today. Who was Richard Strauss, and which people and what places influenced him? A biographical approach to the century artist from Germany. Richard Strauss was born in Munich in 1864, in the closing years of the Bavarian monarchy. He was born into a musical family. His father was a well-known horn player of the Munich court opera and as such an employee of Ludwig II. On his mother's side, Richard was related to the Bülow family. They were the owners of one of the largest breweries in Munich and one of the richest families in the city. Today the company belongs to the traditional Hacker-Bülow brewery. Thus, the family had the means to provide Richard with a sheltered childhood and an excellent education. Strauss was a child prodigy and began composing at the age of 6. He wrote his Opus 1, a festive march for large orchestra, at the age of 12. In 1882, he began studying philosophy and art history at the University of Munich, but soon dropped out to devote his professional life to music. His first works were performed when he was only 19. Richard Strauss had an eventful relationship with Bayreuth and the master throughout his life. Bayreuth is located 200 kilometers north of Munich. His father knew Wagner personally as the horn player of the Munich court opera. The Munich Orchestra was the official orchestra of the Bayreuth Festival, and he sat in the orchestra at the premiere of Meistersinger and Tristan in Munich. Old Strauss was a sharp-tongued critic of Richard Wagner and fought many a battle with the composer. He even organized a strike once after a particularly long day of rehearsals. Wagner took it with humor and said, "Old Strauss may be an obnoxious fellow, but when he blows his horn, you can't be mad at him." Anyway, Strauss' father took his son to Bayreuth in 1882 to see a performance of Parsifal, as a reward for passing his exams, and it was there that Richard got to know the master personally. At the age of 20, he made the acquaintance of Hans von Bülow, who had his main activity in the central German Meiningen. Von Bülow was a companion and one of Wagner's favorite conductors. His personal relationship with Wagner, however, was clouded. Wagner had stolen his wife Cosima from him, and von Bülow had 2 children with her. The Meiningen Orchestra was one of the best in Europe at the end of the 19th century. The arts-minded sovereign George II, known as the Theatre Duke, promoted the arts, and Hans von Bülow led it to the greatest flowering from 1880. Bülow became friends with Johannes Brahms, who conducted the orchestra several times, and had his 4th symphony premiered there. Strauss got to know Brahms in this way. Brahms is also said to have given Strauss a quite nice young man to his F minor symphony, which was a compliment coming from Brahms. Strauss had been a Brahmsian until then. In these decisive years, Strauss underwent a change of heart. In the midst of the greatest cultural struggle of the 19th century, that between the New Germans around Wagner and the traditionalists around Brahms, Strauss became a Wagnerian under the influence of the concertmaster and Wagner devotee Alexander Ritter, and switched from the symphony to the form of the symphonic poem. After a trip to Italy, he wrote from Italy his first work in this genre. Soon after, Don Juan and Death and Transfiguration appeared. At the age of 22, he returned to the court opera as 3rd Kapellmeister. However, after the death of Ludwig II, the theatre had to make do with fewer resources, and Strauss had to contend with an unloved repertoire. When he was forbidden to stage Wagner's opera The Fairies, he had had enough and left Munich for Weimar. During a guest performance in Leipzig, he met the singer Pauline de Ahna. She then accompanied him to his next place of work, Weimar. In 1889, Strauss took up his post as a second Kapellmeister in Weimar. The many performances of Wagner operas were acclaimed, and in 1894 Strauss was allowed to successfully premiere the opera Hansel and Gretel by the former Wagner assistant Humperdinck, in which Strauss' later wife Pauline sang Hansel. Pauline de Ahna also sang at the premiere of Strauss' first opera Guntram in Weimar, but the night opera set in Wagnerian manner was not a success, quite in contrast to his symphonic poems, which were immensely successful. Strauss now developed a steady concert schedule throughout Germany to get his tone poems on the playbills. In 1894, Pauline and Richard were married. They left Weimar and went back to Munich. But before that, there was still an honorable task to be done in Bayreuth. After Richard Wagner's death, Cosima had assumed responsibility for the Bayreuth festival. Cosima became aware of the talented conductor and ardent Wagner supporter, and the two became friends. Cosima recognized Strauss' potential and even wanted to set him up with her daughter Eva. As a highlight, he was allowed to conduct the Tannhäuser premiere in Bayreuth in 1894, with his future wife Pauline singing the role of Eva. Strauss now returned to Munich as Kapellmeister at the age of 30. As a composer, Strauss began to turn back to symphonic poetry in Munich after the failure of Guntram, and wrote Till Eulenspiegel. It became his first stroke of genius and immediately caught on. Subsequently, Strauss wrote a new successful symphonic poem every year in Munich. But he left his hometown after 4 years in anger, when, after Hermann Levy's death, he was not considered as his successor as first Kapellmeister. His rage was so great that he wrote Feuer's Note, an opera about the sham mortality of the citizens of a city. It was his reckoning with Munich. His departure was final. His most important cities artistically were now to become others. As the capital of the German Empire, Berlin had become the cultural metropolis of Germany, and Berlin became the residence of the Strauss family for the next 20 years. Although he wrote positively about his time in Berlin in his memoirs, he did not really warm up to the imperial city. Despite living here for 20 years, he was only renting. One of his luxurious apartments was located here on Heerstraße, on the 4th floor. In the meantime, son Franz had been born, and the family began to spend more time in their newly built villa in Garmisch. Strauss remained at the court opera for 20 years, but his relationship with the Berliners was not unclouded. Strauss was hired as Kapellmeister at the opera Unter den Linden and wanted to stage his Guntram and the Feuer's Note there. This was not approved for him. This was a mistake on the part of the Berliners, for Strauss then decided not to have his future operas performed in Berlin. In fact, Dresden and Vienna became the performance cities for his future operas. Even at the only premiere in Berlin, his Alpine Symphony, the Dresden Orchestra played in the hall. Strauss became one of the most influential figures in classical music. Strauss maintained a long-standing acquaintance with Mahler, who was such a polar opposite, and the two influential composer-conductors performed each other's work. In 1904, Pauline and Richard went by ship to the USA, where the composer received ovations everywhere. 35 concerts in 2 months, with innumerable appointments, left the Strausses no free minutes. The premiere of the Sinfonia Domestica took place in Carnegie Hall. He was not particularly pleased with the New York Orchestra and called them a gang of anarchists, while the Boston musicians delighted him. A concert by the enterprising Strauss in the Wanamaker department store, where a floor was cleared, was a special experience. In Germany, however, the concert led to nose rubbing. Strauss now began to turn seriously to composing operas. he chose nearby Dresden as the site of the premieres of his next works. In the beginning, there was Salome. Richard Strauss first saw the theatre play Salome by Oscar Wilde in 1902. The material of a 16-year-old virgin kissing the severed head of John the Baptist was received in 1892 as an outrageous perversion, respectively as the result of moral depravity, and caused a solid scandal. In the meantime, 13 years had passed since the first performance of Oscar Wilde's play, and the piece, now set to music as an opera, again met with open hostility from traditionalists. Even Kaiser Wilhelm felt compelled to comment on Salome. Even the Salome of the premiere, Marie Wittig, refused at first to sing the part on the grounds that she was a decent woman. Strauss mocked the reaction of Und Wittig and threatened to move the premiere to Berlin. But the premiere in Dresden became a sensation and Salome began its triumphal march around the world. Strauss had created an expressionist sound world for this opera that seemed to break with everything previously known and became the leading avant-gardist of classical music. In 1908, Strauss moved into the nearly built house in rural Garmisch-Partenkirchen, financed with the proceeds of his Salome. The villa served first as a summer retreat and later as a residence, where he enjoyed family life and in whose study most of the works from Elektra onward were written. Richard Strauss surprised the world with his next work. Elektra was the first collaboration with Hugo von Hofmannsthal. It was followed by a 20-year influential artistic partnership at eye level. No one would deny the kinship of Elektra with Salome. The two works are too similar. The closeness concerns the expressiveness of the music as well as the characters of the opera. The role of Elektra occupies a special position in opera literature. No other character, not even that of Salome or Lady Macbeth, has ever been musically set to music with such excessive drive and obsession. Elektra is non-stop on stage and always the center of the stage action. Her voice must sing non-stop against a large orchestra to make one feel the threshold of madness. After less than 2 hours, the stage curtain falls. The singer of Elektra and the listener could probably not be expected to do more. The opera was received with reserve at its premiere. Although it was quickly performed in many opera houses, reactions remained mixed. It was acclaimed by the avant-gardists and critically received by the conservatives. Strauss had not yet crossed the Rubicon of tonality. The music world was eagerly awaiting his next step. What came next was completely unexpected, for after Elektra and Salome, Strauss literally thirsted to create a cheerful work. Inspired by Mozart, Hofmannsthal had the plot of the Rosenkavalier set in the Vienna of the 1740s. They called it Our Figaro, for the parallels between Strauss' Rosenkavalier and Mozart's Figaro are striking. In addition to the Rococo style, the parallels between the Countess and the Marschallin, as well as Cherubino and Octavian, are especially striking to the eyes and ears. When the lovely waltz sounds of the Rosenkavalier reached the stages, many fellow artists could not believe it. How could Strauss write such a backward-looking work? Otto Klemperer simply called it sugar water. After the avant-garde Elektra and Salome, for avant-garde artists it was the throwback to a world they had thought was behind them. For Strauss it was a return to the musical realm of the tonal, and henceforth he was branded a conservative by the avant-garde. Strauss had made up his mind. He did not want to go the way of Webern, Schönberg or Stravinsky. The audience cared little for this criticism, and the opera was enthusiastically received from the start. The response was so enormous that the Rosenkavalier special trains had to be used from Berlin to Dresden. Rarely has a work of music been launched with such concentrated artistic firepower as Rosenkavalier in Dresden. The outstanding stage designer Alfred Roller, whose collaboration with Gustav Mahler at the Vienna Court Opera can be mentioned as congenial, was engaged early on to design the sets and figures. His style-defining Rococo motifs of Vienna in the 1740s are particularly noteworthy. His stage designs still set the standard today and influence all productions of this opera. The stage rehearsals for the premiere were supervised by none other than Max Reinhardt, who was engaged at Strauss' request, but whose name was not mentioned at premiere, possibly for anti-Semitic reasons. The outbreak of World War I brought the unique flowering to an abrupt crash. Artistically, the war years were rather lean. 1916 saw the work Ariadne auf Naxos, a collaboration with Hofmannsthal and Reinhardt. It is a middle ground between opera and drama. Financially, the World War was bitter for the Strauss family. Strauss lost almost his entire fortune. The money deposited in London was confiscated as enemy assets. Only his villa survived the war. After the war, he moved to Vienna to the State Opera. Along with Dresden, Vienna became Strauss' most important artistic station. Here, two of his operas were premiered, Ariadne and the second version of Frau ohne Schatten. And he held the office for State Opera Director for 5 years. He had a prestigious 3-story house built on Jackie-Gasse by a renowned architect. The beautiful building still stands, but can only be inspected from the outside, as it is the seat of the Dutch embassy. With the end of his work as director of the State Opera in 1924, Strauss began his time as a freelance artist. Garmisch definitely became the Strauss main residence. There he enjoyed family life. He composed the Intermezzo, a parody of his own family, and cultivated his passion for Skat, a popular German card game. In 1923, his bourgeois opera Intermezzo was premiered. Strauss wrote the libretto and music himself right away, since it was an autobiographical comedy set in the villa of the court conductor Stork, a pun since Strauss means ostrich in English. The Oriel of the villa became famous when it was recreated in the stage set in the card scene of the premiere. In the process, he composed a fortissimo in G major for a strong hand. Strauss, together with Hofmannsthal, was very committed to the development of the Salzburg festival. European cultural life lay in ruins after the First World War, and they wanted to breathe life back into it with glittering festival. Strauss himself conducted the first opera performance, Don Giovanni, with his Vienna State Opera Orchestra. Hofmannsthal also presented his Jedermann. Strauss never considered emigration during the Nazi period. He was too deeply rooted in Central European culture. At the beginning, Strauss had hopes of reorganizing the musical world with the new rulers. In 1933, he became Reichsmusikdirektor in the Nazi administration. He also re-established contact with the Nazi cult center of Bayreuth. The once friendly relationship between Cosima Wagner had cooled down with Strauss' opera Salome. Cosima was not at all amused by the musical style and content of the opera. She called the work an opera about a Jewish girl. Later, the two made up, and Strauss stepped in as conductor of Parsifal in Bayreuth in 1933, when Toscanini left the Nazi-friendly Bayreuth in a rage. Strauss had frequent contact with Nazi bigwigs, who made their mark with the world-famous artist. But the Nazis did not trust Strauss. This was evident in his opera Die schweigsame Frau. The librettist was the Jewish-born Stefan Zweig. Because of his importance for the Nazis, Strauss was able to push through this personal decision, which was toxic for the Nazis, and Hitler personally gave permission. After the third performance, however, it was over. For one thing, Strauss had prominently listed the Jew's name, and the Nazis intercepted a letter Strauss had written to the emigrant poet, prophesying the imminent end of Nazi rule. Strauss was dismissed as Reich's music director. He left Garmisch for safety reasons, fearing in particular for his Jewish daughter-in-law, Alice. The family decided to spend the war years in Vienna, where they were under the protection of Baldur von Schirach. Age works such as Love of the Danais, Capriccio and the Second Horn Concerto were written. Almost 40 years had passed since his departure in anger from his hometown. It was not until his friend Clemens Krauss, presumably through Hitler's mediation, took over as director of the Munich Opera that two premieres took place there: Friedenstag in 1938 and Capriccio in 1942. When the war ended, Germany was in dire need. Even Strauss had no means of obtaining coal to heat his villa in Garmisch. His home lay in ruins. In addition, he had to face a denazification procedure that made it impossible for him to access his remaining assets. Almost penniless, Strauss decided to leave Germany with his wife for Switzerland, unaware that he was embarking on a 3-year odyssey. There, he was supported by Swiss friends who provided him with hotel stays and a certain lifestyle. He already knew the Verena Hof in the spa town of Baden, where he had stayed earlier. At the same time, Hermann Hesse, who had received the Nobel Prize for Literature shortly before, was staying there as a spa guest. Strauss wanted to meet him, but Hesse was irritated by Strauss' attitude toward the Third Reich. It is not clear whether a meeting took place. Strauss, with the help of Swiss authorities, also managed to get his son Franz to Switzerland in 1947, who encouraged him to compose again. Strauss chose 3 poems by Hesse and 1 poem by Eichendorff and wrote the Tandescent 4 last songs. Strauss was a difficult hotel guest and he changed his place of residence frequently. He liked to spend his summers in the Engadine, where he found leisure to compose and wrote the first 2 pieces of the 4 last songs. Full of melancholy about the vanished world and his and Pauline's imminent death, he began composing the last song of the 4 last songs. Full of melancholy about the vanished world and his and Pauline's imminent death, he began composing the last song of the 4 last songs, the famous Evening Red. Richard Strauss was exonerated in the denazification proceedings and returned to Germany in 1949. Shortly before his death, his last performance as a musician took place. As a very old man, he climbed the conductor's podium once again at the Prinzregenten Theater in Munich and conducted the 2nd act of his Rosenkavalier. After his return to Garmisch in May 1949, Strauss had only a few months left. He received many honors in that short time. After a stroke in August, the last great opera composer in the history of music died in his bed on September 8, 1949. Pauline followed him 8 months later. Richard Strauss' abdication took place in Munich. His urn is in the family grave in the Garmisch cemetery.